the book is a really fascinating read. There's so many extraordinary perspectives that it really made me think again. And I love the fact that you invite new input and new conversations, and it's not a kind of the end of the story. It's the start of conversation, or the beginning of a conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's important to stress that I don't think that any of the scholarly work we're doing now is like the end of anything, that it has to be an invitation for early career scholars to take us in new and more exciting directions. So I look forward to, Cambridge Companion to Shakespeare and Race 2, 3, 4, 5, right?
But it is really an interesting, because that is what's so fascinating is the way what the book represents is a whole series of new perspectives that have hitherto been not invited to the table, if you like, or not until very recently.
Yeah, I tried to, and I have to say, I want to give credit to Emily for being a really wonderful commissioning editor, because she encouraged me to kind of think about whose voices I wanted included, but also to make sure that the perspectives were as intersectional as possible. So we've got essays that are dealing with kind of thinking about the archives anew, essays that are thinking about genre and how, histories, comedies, and tragedies treat race differently, essays on specific plays, and then there's a whole section on performance, and with an amazing essay by Adrian Lester about his experiences doing Othello. And then the ending essays really point us in new theoretical directions, and I think this is the space where I'm looking forward to the voices that take on the next iteration of this kind of scholarship, but thinking about critical white studies, thinking about post-colonial studies, thinking about, where Shakespeare falls in the progressive conservative spectrum. So, yeah.
Well, it's also, I think it's really interesting how you define racecraft. I thought that was a new one to me, racecraft. And I found those definitions really intriguing in terms of thinking about Shakespeare, and both in his time but in our time now. And one of the things I wanted to ask you was, it feels like, of course, in the Black Lives Matter moment, it feels like this is an extraordinarily timely book, but you must have begun this book quite some time ago, obviously.
Yeah, I know. I think Emily and I are thinking our lucky stars that the timing is so good. But yes, this project was started several years ago. But I also think that the scholars who've been working on issues of race and intersectionality and racecraft in Shakespeare, this is a longer conversation. And as I say in the introduction, this is the book that I would have wanted to read when I was a student, but it wasn't, the discourse wasn't available at the time. So yeah, so it's timely, but it's also overdue.
Yeah, I think that's right. But what a fascinating group of I mean, I found out, I am finding out as I read through it, so much, and so fascinating perspectives. I mean, I did know about Ira Aldridge, but some of the other perspectives about performance in America, that was really interesting to me, and the blackface conversation too fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think the scholars are really digging into some archival materials that I think are underexplored, and some of them erased at times. But Urvashi Chakravarti, for example, does this amazing piece on kind of actors of color in the UK from like the 17th century on, and looking through criminal records to find evidence of Black performers. It's just a remarkable piece of scholarship.
And that was really interesting. That, of course, Othello defines the male actors, and it's harder to find the Black female
Much
actors.
harder. Yes, much harder. And yeah, Joyce McDonald's essay on female actors is great too. But and she says, like, it's frustrating that there's so much less archival footprint for these women.
Yeah, but just the identifying the areas through I mean, through the canon of where Shakespeare is talking about blackness, and I know certainly that I've found in performance there are times when you go, is this the characters being deliberately racist, or is this just pandering to a section of the audience who will laugh at those kind of jokes? I mean, that bit in Love's Labour's Lost where Dumain and Barone and Longueville debate their loves just before the most glorious speech in the entire play, Affection's Men at Arms, and they're talking about the blackness of Barone's beloved, and at one point they talk about colliers and they talk about probably Ethiops. I can't remember whether that's but one of those. But then he says that here's the comparison: my shoe and her face, and you go, wow, that's a staggering piece of misogyny apart from anything else. I think it's almost the same that Dromio does one of the same things. But yeah, I remember us doing that in rehearsal and going, can we make these boys just really inappropriate, or is this just offensive?
Yeah, so what did you do? Did you cut it out? Because I've talked to a lot of directors who have cast their Love's Labour's Lost diversely, and then they get to that moment and they're like, oh wait, I didn't think this through. So what did you do? Do you remember?
Well, partly we cast it because of that dialogue, so that that doesn't make sense if she's blonde and fair, if Rosaline is blonde and fair. We certainly rehearsed it and tried quite some time ago now, but we certainly rehearsed it and tried to see how what I don't want to do with when you're considering cutting is cut complexity.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to me to be really important, and it comes up with Portia, doesn't it? Portia's
would all his complexion choose?
Yes, yeah, choose me so, yeah. But and it's whether you it's of course how you set those plays too. If they're absolutely contemporary settings, those you can often exoticize them by disguising them in doublet and hose. You can remove them back and say, oh well, they were Elizabethan. But that doesn't do it for me. I don't think. I think my feeling is that, I guess certainly as artistic director of the RSC, I need each production to take on that challenge and make its own decisions. I don't want to make some kind of policy decision that says, if there's any racism, cut it. I remember, for instance, the Ethiop line when I did Much Ado, and Claudio says, that he'll hose. Was she an Ethiop?
I'd marry her were she an Ethiop, right?
Which is him saying, I've killed Hero. This woman you've now presented to me, I am not going to go back on my word. I'd marry her even if she were an Ethiop. We had Noma Dumzweni, who was playing Ursula, right next to him as he said that line, and just clock him to check his racism, his just unconsidered language, which pointed the fact of the line. Was it still offensive? I don't know. It embraced the complexity of quite a challenging character. Claudio he's riven with complexity.
Yes.
Claudio, I think.
Yeah. And I think that's what I wanted to come across in the volume, was that a lot of times scholars who deal with race in early modern period or in early modern texts only deal with them as pieces on the page. And I think it's really important to bring the performance aspect in, because these are, as you just articulated so wonderfully, like it's a decision every single time. And there isn't like a clear cut, this is the right way to do it, this is the wrong way to do it. It's an ever evolving conversation with your community of actors, your artistic community. And that's the part where I'm like, right, if it's a living thing as opposed to just something on the page, that's what's more interesting for me.
Yeah, and I think there are times when you see the language can point to underlying tensions in that society.
Yeah.
I did a production of Titus Andronicus in Johannesburg, the Market Theatre in Joburg. And there was the line. So we had a very diverse cast. Aaron the Moor was the only black actor, but Tamara's sons, Kyron and Demetrius, were in South African terms Cape-coloured, so they were mixed heritage, as was Bassianus. So when Bassianus says to when they're taunting Tamara and her relation and about her relationship with Aaron, he calls her he calls Aaron the swart Cimmerian, which in the visceral sounds of the Cape-coloured accent sounded even more poisonous. But it for the audience, it had a completely other aspect, because Titus and his family were, well, Titus himself was a kind of unreconstructed Boer general, and the Swart Gevaar in South Africa is the Black Peril, or it was the Black Peril. It was the sense that the white majority feared being overwhelmed by the white minority, feared being overwhelmed by the black majority. So suddenly, a coloured man saying to about a black man that he was a swart Cimmerian being a sort of ancient nomadic people of the mists, I guess, is somehow it just doubled the weight of that. I don't know, because you, of course, have just been working on the Arden Titus. Is that that must be a very particular moment of interest for you?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many interests in Titus, so. But yes, I think what you're getting at so clearly, though, is that the context matter. Where you perform these plays, you're going to get new meanings that didn't occur to Shakespeare, couldn't have occurred to Shakespeare, but are still really important. And those layerings of meanings, where when you change location, time, space, like that's pretty amazing. And also the thing that we need to keep digging into, and also the kind of global nature of Shakespeare, and the fact that race is global, right? It's a global phenomenon. It may not look the way that race is discussed in some places is not going to be exactly the way it's discussed in the US or the UK, but but they're still all there. I feel like, probably the next version of this book for the younger scholar who will do it will have a more global perspective, because this volume is definitely US, UK based, but there's a way for this to become a much more global and more complex discussion, as your Swart Cimmerian example in South Africa demonstrates.
Yeah, and interestingly, I was invited to do The Merchant of Venice in Tokyo in Japanese, of which I didn't speak a word. But it was such a different experience from doing that play in the UK, partly because Japanese society is very monocultural, so there were no black actors to play the Prince of Morocco. And there was not the same historical sense of the Holocaust. So it wasn't a play, in a way, it wasn't a text that had it, for the Japanese, been hijacked by the Holocaust, if you like. That's not an offensive way of putting it. Nor, in a way, race was a different issue. And I remember with the company trying to get them to address the equivalency of race in Japan. And what was really interesting was that none of them would say anything. And then they would all say it to me privately. And then one of them said, the reason nobody's talking is because your assistant director's Korean. So there was an underlying sense of a kind of race issue that covered the play, but it meant that, so I went, okay, so how are we going to do the Prince of Morocco? Am I actually going to be doing a production in which somebody's going into blackface? Are we getting the burnt cork out, as Farrow's wonderful article reminds us that they might have done that then? And we came up with a completely different idea, which was that Bassanio would play both the Prince of Morocco and the Prince of Aragon. Maybe that's why he had to borrow quite so much money from Shylock, and therefore had two goes at the casket. So it's hard, isn't it, to understand how it is that Shakespeare is thinking of the Prince of Morocco. I've seen very persuasive, Trevor Nunn's production I thought was very persuasively placing the Prince of Morocco in a context in which he was not a gollywog, if you like, that he was not a cartoon character of absurdity, and I thought it was really interesting the way they did that. What it was like in Shakespeare's time, I thought some of the essays in the book were addressing that in a really interesting way. I'm not sure what conclusions I myself came to, but really interesting to address those.
Yeah, I think Dennis Britton's great essay on Merchant in the Collection thinks through the religious aspects in a pretty complicated way, as you say. Like, you at the end, you're like, what do we do with this text? And I'm really interested in your Merchant example in Tokyo, because of course when I'm teaching Merchant, I tell my students, right, it's hard for us to imagine that this play is a comedy, because we are in the aftermath of the Holocaust, right? Like, a genocide has occurred, and so that affects the way that we encounter this play. But as you say, in Japan, if that's not the dominant lens, like, just does it land back in comedy land, or how does it work?
Yeah, well, in a way, of course, it became a virtuoso performance for Bassanio, because he got to play this sort of, I mean, the Prince of Aragon is a bit of a caricature too. He's one of the perhaps only three Spanish characters in Shakespeare, and the relationship with Spain is complex. But he got to, so we played him as an old Spanish grandee as Aragon, and black as with an Afro wig as Morocco. What became really interesting about it, I mean, it's clearly not Shakespeare's intention, but it made you listen to this, knowing that he knew that it was in the lead casket. There was the sort of aspect of, oh, he's cheated, but it ties in with the aspect of, isn't Portia leading you to that by all the rhymes in the song rhyming with lead? So isn't she cheating anyway, because that's the one she fancies? But it made you address the value speech. In other words, what Bassanio learns when he does open the casket, as to, it's not good enough to know, okay, I've got the lead casket, I've won. It's what does he learn about the value system in the process. Even though he couches it again in some pretty interesting language about Egyptians.
And I think that what he learns about the value system is part of racecraft, right? Like, that if this is a social construction, which it is, and one that we're constantly, it's like the most opportunistic construction, right? Because it's ever changing, ever evolving. People are in, people are out. But that moment is exactly the moment when Bassanio is like, right, I'm going to be the insider, and we are going to be the insiders together. And, who knows about Jessica at the end, right?
That's a really interesting one, isn't it? I mean, that play, for me personally, has had a whole series of sharpened perspectives. I joined the RSC as an actor in 1987 and played Salanio, and indeed met my now partner, my now husband, Anthony Sher, playing Shylock. It was back in, as I say, 1987, at the height of apartheid. Tony was born in Cape Town. There were other South Africans in the company and quite a number of black actors in the company. And when it got to the moment of the birthday performance, and I'm sure that some of the viewers will know that the birthday performance in Stratford is a big event, and it used to be the case that we would invite all the ambassadors and high commissioners that are accredited at the Court of St. James would be invited to Stratford for the parade and for the birthday performance and all that palaver. Including, just a quick digression, we just talked about this before, including in 1938, as the flags were unfurled of all the nations down Bridge Street, which is caught on Pathé News Reel, you can catch this. The news commentator reminds us that Austria is not present in this year's parade, and then bang, all the flags unfurled, and there is the swastika being represented on Bridge Street in Stratford-on-Avon. I digress. That performance in 1987, we discovered that the South African the cultural attaché, I should say, was to be present at the performance. And a number of the company, well, in fact, the whole company got together and said, we're not going to do it. We're not going to perform. If he's in the audience, we're not doing it. And the argument was made that it is much better to let Shakespeare speak and to let the performance speak. And of course, what happened was a really extraordinary electricity that happened in that house. We discovered where he was sitting in the audience. And when it got, for instance, to the opening of the Prince of Morocco scene, the actor playing him, Hakim Kazim, came right down to the front of the stage, directed himself at the cultural attaché and said, "Mislike me not for my complexion," which had, the whole house were then so alert to the whole issues of race, racism in the piece. But then when it got to the trial scene, Tony as Shylock, this was completely spontaneous. They hadn't rehearsed it, nothing, we hadn't discussed it even. There was a court attendant at the back of the stage who was, sort of spear carrying in a way, called Akim Mugaji. And Tony grabbed him and brought him to the front of the stage and virtually shook him at the South African cultural attaché with the lines, "You have among you many a purchased slave, which like your asses and your mules and dogs, you use badly because you purchased them, because they're yours. Well, I will do what I want with what I have, which is the pound of flesh which I have purchased." And of course, certainly on stage, but the whole audience just knew exactly what was being addressed at that particular point, a point about apartheid. So it was, the play just had a completely different meaning that night, and the production was never the same again. All those issues were just heightened and deepened and made more complex, I guess.
Yes.
But, I mean, really,
and I think that's sort of the amazing thing about, well, obviously both of our lives have been spent with Shakespeare, but like the amazing thing about Shakespeare as a playwright, that it is so complex, right? And the moment that you think like, I've pinned it down, this is what it means, and then you're like, oh no, the world's changed, and actually the meaning has to change. And I think Miles Greer's essay about like, are these plays progressive is quite perfect, because he's like, no, it's like they are what we want them to be at specific moments. We may want them to be progressive and they may not be that at that moment. But really it's what we do with them. And as your amazing example of the merchant production, I wish I had seen it.
It's a really, I think that essay is brilliant, and you're absolutely right. It's, we kind of want to shape Shakespeare in our image, and I, in terms of Merchant of Venice, I find myself, and I wouldn't I, saying to directors, certainly Polly Finlay when she did it just for us just recently, saying, I think it's a dereliction of duty in the 21st century not to recognize Antonio's relationship with Bassanio is of a gay man besotted by a younger man who may or may not, swing both ways, or may not, but it's to ignore the issues of sexuality that are also there in that play is to only do half the play, and I find that very interesting, that Shakespeare is. I've said this before, and others have said it, but he is like a magnet that attracts all the iron filings of what's going on in the world. I mean, and if you're not, particularly, I guess, perhaps particularly in performance, because it's so immediate, and so we're in the moment now. We're having it on, it to be over in 6 months, and things will move on again. And I know that when I come back to a play, which I rarely have, in fact, I've plenty of other ones to do, but you realize that you think completely differently about them. And from my experience, I also feel the need not to impose too much on it in terms of production, if you can, before you start, because the play's meaning will shift even through the rehearsal process and through the I remember doing King John during some years ago now, and we had found the play. There have been several productions of King John at the ROC recently, but then it was only the fourth production the ROC had ever done. It wasn't a play that we knew. It wasn't a play that we brought a lot of baggage to, of precedent. And it shifted its meaning in a way that was really interesting. In that, who is the bastard and what is he doing, and how is he negotiating his way through this new society that he's been plunged into? And then one Tuesday matinee, we didn't usually do Tuesday matinees, but it was a Tuesday matinee in September. And this is pre everybody having mobile phones. They were on stage. The matinee had started at 1:30, and there was a television in the crew room downstairs. And suddenly a plane flew into a building in New York, and the whole company knew, were crowding around the television set in between the calls, thinking, "Oh, what a terrible accident!" And then, of course, just before the interval, the second plane flew into the second tower. And everybody said, "Well, we can't carry on. We must go in front of the audience and tell them what's happened." None of them knew when they came back from the interval. None of them had found out. There was no. And then the second half of the play, the bastard himself. Well, the second half of the play, Prince Arthur falls from a high tower, and the bastard says, "I lose my way among the thorns and dangers of this world," and and the line about discord waiting upon the world like a raven on a sick fallen beast, and it articulated so precisely what everybody at that moment was feeling. And as the performances, production continued, you could not but relate to, and this is not about race, sorry, I'm digressing, but it was just an example of how you have to allow the plays to breathe and take on extra resonance as those resonances, as events in the world occur, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's profound. And one way that I could relate it to race is I think Arthur Little's brilliant essay on whiteness and how whiteness gets crafted speaks really profoundly to, at least in the US, but I think in the UK too right now, where we're looking at each other and we're not even, like, white people aren't recognizing other white people as white. And so I think that, like, the way that he's working through the way that whiteness is crafted by some of the characters in complex ways. His reading of Phoebe in As You Like It, I think, is probably one of the best readings of any play ever.
I wish I'd read that before I did the play.
But yes, I think, right, there's only a way to understand that because of the moment we're in, right? Like that's how we open up this text anew over and over again, right? It's like bringing the world that we currently live in to these older texts. So, yeah.
That's it.
So are we supposed to allow Emily to come back in to ask us questions?
Yeah.
Hello, Emily.
Here I am. The first question we have from an audience member is, what do you make of Ian Smith's revelation that Othello's handkerchief is black, and a history of productions that ignored such a clear detail and used a white hanky? Thoughts? Question mark.
Okay, so Ian's. Oh, go ahead, Greg. Do you wanna go first?
No, I had up and say I had a white gossamer hanky with strawberries on it. Yeah.
Well, I have to say, I think Ian Smith's essay that was published in Shakespeare Quarterly a couple of years ago is probably one of the most important pieces of Shakespeare scholarship in the last 25, 30 years. And his close attention to historical details about where these cloths were coming from, this vast importation of them from Morocco, the way he thinks through mummy and what mummy meant in the early modern period, and the way he ties it to the way that race was portrayed through prosthetics, I think is one of the best pieces of scholarship that I've read. So I totally agree, but it is also unusual when people see a brown handkerchief, because I think the Globe used one in their recent production. And I remember the reviewers were like, we don't understand. It's like a moment of like, we expect one thing, and when you give us something else, it's hard. Like there's cognitive dissonance that occurs. So.
Yeah. I Died in Mummy is such an extraordinary, I mean, there's magic in the web of it, and the sense that the Othello is himself embroidering the mythology of the handkerchief, and that in the Elizabethan period, there were Brits who were traveling to Egypt and being lowered down into pyramids and snapping off bits of mummies and taking them back to the UK. It's a mind-blowing thought, isn't it? You don't think of ruffs and doublets descending into pyramids.
Yeah, that leads us quite nicely into the next question, which is really about the early modern context, and whether you could say a bit more about whether Shakespeare had an idea of race and constructions of race within the context of colonial expansion and the New World.
I think the answer has to be yes. I think Shakespeare was interested in the globe, and the way that he populates his plays with different peoples from different countries shows not only an awareness but an interest. And I'll say that the kind of great essay by Amberine Databoy in the collection, where she talks about the Moroccan and Moorish presence in England at the time, and the way that the English were kind of, struggling with this advanced empire and trying to figure out how to place them, I think does help us approach Shakespeare in a new way. So yes, I think the answer has to be yes.
And I think I think it was becoming an issue for his context, for the other fellow playwrights as well. And I think it's sometimes we have to, but sometimes we divorce Shakespeare from the stable of writers who he was writing with. And I remember doing The Island Princess by Fletcher, who was Shakespeare's collaborator at the end of his career, and which is about the whole process of colonial expansion, and about, it goes back to an issue of the Portuguese arriving in an island in the Moluccas, and basically the villain of the piece sort of says, don't you realize why they've come over here? They want to take over our country. So I think he was, I think they were profoundly aware of the issues, as indeed Shakespeare is touching on in the Tempest, as we know, with Caliban and Sycorax. But there's those issues become more and more debated in some of the other contemporary work at the time.
Absolutely, and also I'll just say that probably, Greg, when both of us were taught Shakespeare, we were told that Shakespeare wouldn't have known any Jews and wouldn't have known any Africans. And thanks to primarily the great work of Imtiaz Habib, the late great Imtiaz Habib, we know that that's just simply not true, that there were so many people of color in London, right? Like, this was not a homogenous city. It was a really diverse city. And once you then realize, like, what happens if there were Africans watching the plays in the Globe, then you realize, like, right, he's engaging in a more diverse world than we at least were taught many moons ago.
You're absolutely right. And those issues of immigration, you know, in the Thomas More play, the great Thomas More speech about the strangers, you know, is evidence of, you know, and is reflected. Indeed, I did a production of it when I was at university in Bristol, having just sort of discovered the play, never knew about it before, and it happened that there were race riots going on at the bottom of my road in St Paul's in Brixton, and I read this play. It stopped being a curiosity and suddenly turned into a plea to, you know, where there's a riot where these people are saying they're coming over here and taking our jobs and stealing our women, which was exactly how the play was portraying the Londoners' reaction to the men from Piedmont and wherever else. You know, I think those issues were very, very alive in Shakespeare's audience's minds, at any rate. I
agree.
We've got a great question from Jennifer Huang. This is a question for Ayanna. I think you've mentioned elsewhere that performances of Othello are inescapably problematic, and efforts to teach the play at the high school level may be as well. Is there a way to teach it responsibly? If yes, what might that look like?
Yeah, I mean, so for me personally, I'm not interested in seeing another Othello for a while. I think let's have a little Othello hiatus. But I actually think it's a great teaching text. And for at the high school level, it can be wonderful if the teacher is comfortable having conversations about race. And I think you have to train yourself to do that. And that's, you know, regardless of whether you're doing Shakespeare or not, you should be trained in creating a safe space where you can have honest conversations with this amazing Generation Z, who want us to have these conversations. So yes, I think high school teachers should do it, but they have to have a frame around the text that allows the students to explore race in all of its complexities. And I'll put in a plug for our the teaching book that I co-authored with Laura Turchi, where we do offer a set of resources about how to do this. So that's Teaching Shakespeare with Purpose.
And the first time we worked together as well via that book.
Yes.
Another question about performance history, and whether you can both speak a bit more about the early performance history of actors of colour in Shakespeare plays, both either in the UK or in the US.
Shall I go on the certainly in terms of I have a little ebony statuette in my office. I haven't been in my office for 9 months, but it is there, which celebrates Edric Connor, who was the first black actor to appear at Stratford. For the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre, at any rate. I think Ira Aldridge might have appeared, certainly in Coventry, so he may have appeared in Stratford. But Edric Connor played Gower, a sort of calypso singing Gower. He was Trinidadian, and he was that first black actor, and his daughter gave this little ebony statuette to remind us of that. So that's 60 years ago. It was 1958, 62 years ago now, when he appeared. And I know Ayanna, you have a very particular memory of one of the next generation, but one of actors from that, which was Hugh Quashie's appearance in Romeo and Juliet.
Yes, first professional theater I ever saw was 1986 production of Romeo and Juliet at the Royal Shakespeare Company. Sean Bean as Romeo, Neem Cusack as Juliet, and Hugh Quashie as Tybalt, and it was amazing. I think seeing that early in my life made me realize, or imprinted upon me, that Shakespeare was meant to be multicultural. But if we want to go way back, I think some of the earliest performances, there's a weird record of Richard Crafis, who was captured in the War of 1812 by the British Admiralty and brought to Dartmoor Prison in Devonshire. And the prisoners put on productions and to compete with each other. And there was a black ward called Number 4, and they put on productions. And we have diaries from the white prisoners that talk about their productions of Shakespeare. So this is 1814. So this is slightly before the African Grove Theater in New York, which is usually marked as the kind of big moment of the birth of Black Shakespeare, where Ira Aldridge got his start, and then he shortly thereafter went to the UK and then all of Eastern Europe. So that's sort of the earlier lineage. But there are essays in the book that do a really great job of this, so you should get the book.
A question from Debbie Schochter. She says, so this is kind of talking about contemporary performance practices. There seems to be a difference between the willingness of directors in the UK versus the US and Canada in casting colorblind. How do you account for those differences?
I think this is your speciality, Ayanna, but I can see.
Greg's laughing because, I've bent his ear a bit about this. So yes, so colorblind casting, which is a term that's not really used much anymore, got its birth in productions of Shakespeare in New York in the 1950s. And that was through the Joseph Papp and the creation of the New York Shakespeare Festival. And it was a way for him to say that, Shakespeare was for everyone, and that meant that it had to look like everyone in New York. And that was the kind of ethos of it, was that, this was a way of integrating the theaters and a way of showing that racial differences didn't matter. And the idea was that if you don't have people supposedly noticing the race of the actors on stage, that it was a meritocracy. Papp's ideas did evolve, and he walked away from colorblind casting and moved towards color conscious casting later in his life, saying that actually, what you show on stage should reflect a reality, and part of the reality is that we do notice race. So I would say in the US and the UK, we've moved more towards this kind of inclusive casting, but that has a kind of cultural consciousness to it. And the UK has not done that, and I think to the detriment. But Greg could maybe defend it.
It's a very hot topic, isn't it? I mean, it's, as you say, as you describe it in your book, Ayanna, you talk about racially attentive casting, and I think that's right. I think the problem with the term colorblind is that it is not blind. Right. You can't just make it and anonymize it, if you like. It's there, and depending on your color, you will see it in whichever way you do. I mean, I think there are a whole series of issues, and I think there are a whole series of challenges around it. From back to David Oyelowo playing Henry VI, the first black actor to play an English king. And it was a very significant moment. I think I was actually discussing this with David just last week on our Talking Shakespeare program. And he was fascinating about the challenges of being a pioneer, and that overwhelms the playing of the part. It becomes so predominant in people's perception of what's going on, and the questions that they ask are not necessarily the relevant questions, or the questions that the performer and the interpretation of that performer is thinking about. I do think there are challenges too, in terms of how you run a rep. And I think that can be challenging. It hit me right in the face when I did a season called A World Elsewhere, which was a season of plays about what was going on in the rest of the world in Shakespeare's lifetime, because we, in this country at any rate, we tend to be absolutely Anglo-centric, and we call it the Elizabethan era. Well, that was the Queen in one tiny corner of the world. So we were looking at plays that happened elsewhere, and I chose to do a play that which was translated in 1616 in China, called The Orphan of Zhao. We also did it alongside Boris Godunov's, Pushkin's view of the Russian Tsar, and Galileo, Brecht's view of the Italian philosopher, etc. And we had a very ethnically diverse company playing everything. The British South Asian actors were incensed, because here finally was an opportunity for them to be cast in a specific play, and we decided that they were just part of the company, in which some of them were South Asian, some of them were British, some of them were Moroccan. There were all sorts of people in it. But from their point of view, they were robbed of an opportunity. So the next time, we then put on another great Chinese classic with a cast that were made up of British East Asians. So I think I think when you're doing something in repertoire, that's quite hard. When I did Orinoco in Stratford, suddenly there were 10 black actors, I think, and that was nearly a quarter of the company, therefore were black that year. So that forced the directors to cast those actors across the season. And sometimes there were specific ways in which they could be cast specifically racially, and sometimes they were just being cast because they were the actors they were. So that it's hard to make. Hard doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing it and being very attentive to how you do it, but it is always a challenge. And I think a bit like trying to define the meanings of plays and the meanings of words as you go through. It's not static. I think it's a growing conversation.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, and I am incredibly sympathetic to the difficulties of casting in rep with regards to race. I think that is a unique problem, but most theater companies in the UK are not in rep, and they still have not gotten to the place where they're doing racially attentive casting and being sensitive to the semiotics of the bodies on stage. And I think that's coming. I think that's where we are in 2020, that we're going to have those conversations, and I'm looking forward to it. So,
because you talk about that those actors in a way erase their bodies, I think was a phrase you used,
yeah,
which is really, really interesting. Yeah.
And it's asking actors of color to do something that white actors are never asked to do, which is to kind of efface part of who they are. I mean, of course, when you're acting, you're taking on a different identity, but that it means different things for different bodies and different spaces. So, but as I said, I'm really optimistic about where things will go, once theaters open again, and I think there will be a whole set of different conversations in the UK after this moment. So.
Yeah.
This next one is pretty massive question, but we've got 8 minutes left. So you talked a little bit about the intersectional organisation of the Companion. Professor Thompson, could you speak a bit more about what that brings to our reading of Shakespeare and why that's so crucial?
Yeah, and so for people who don't know, thinking about race in an intersectional way means that you're thinking about gender and class and sexuality and how all of those kind of different categories impact and intersect with understandings of race. So the essays in the companion take on class, take on sexuality, take on religion, and so they all are thinking about the plays through race, but then seeing how race making occurs when you have it intersecting with religion, how race making occurs when you have it intersecting with sexuality. So, so I think, and for example, Melissa Sanchez's amazing essay on Antony and Cleopatra provides a stunning intersectional reading of sexuality and race. So that's just one of the examples.
I think that's so interesting that we can get hijacked by too narrow a focus on the plays and the issues, and they are so intertwined and dependent on performance and where you're performing them and how you're performing them, all those things. So I really welcome the book, not just as a book about race, but a book about shifting the perspective, and I thought that was fascinating.
We've got a question that it loops back to the previous question from Rosaline Simpson. She asks, why is colour conscious casting more difficult in rep?
Because you can be so if you are deciding that you are going to cast a family, so maybe Hamlet, Gertrude, etc. Claudius, Hamlet's father. If you're going to decide that is that is going to be, they're all going to be black, say that's a family thing that you will follow through, and it's about how you then cast them sensitively in the rest of the plays in the season, and because they'll have different meanings. Their own individuality will have different meanings in different contexts. So you can be very, very specific and want to get it absolutely right and mean that it has the casting is so specific. It's just it's harder when you're doing maybe up to 5 plays in a season to be as specific in each one, unless you just go they're just actors. They're actors who are playing parts, and of course, in some ways, that really works. That's really powerful. We did a season last year in which we had a blind actor, a wheelchair user, and a BSL user, British Sign Language user. And for instance, in As You Like It, it's the best performance I've ever seen or best realization of William and Audrey, because William was Audrey's signer, and then he didn't realize that until he was asked about who he was, and so you find really creative ways of using what that actor brings, and that's the ideal. And that can work fantastically well. But if you're imposing a restriction on it, that makes it quite hard. You have to see it as an opportunity rather than a restriction. Not sure.
We've probably got time for one more question. This is a really interesting one from Monique Pittman, who asks, what systems are in place to move directors of colour into positions of authority in companies? And how can diversity of the non-acting creative team address these issues of inclusive representation in performance?
Well, that is an absolutely burning hot topic. And it's one we're addressing at Stratford. In fact, I've been in conversations about that this very day, as to how you do it, how you make sure that there is the opportunity and the training opportunity, and how you make particular communities excited by those opportunities and aware of those opportunities. And it is very significant. It's not just in directing; it's in design. It's in terms of my area of work. It's in terms of where, whether it's set designers, costume designers, lighting designers. It's how people see opportunities that they wouldn't necessarily think were specifically for them. And I think there are lots of ways of doing that. I think we do it at Stratford. I think we do it very well on the stage. I think their sense of this being a company that on stage reflects the diversity of the country, is both whether that's regionally, socially, disability, ethnicity, etc. I think it's harder but as urgent to make sure that's happening backstage, whether that's directing or whether that's in the workshops, in the paint shop, etc. So that's our area of focus, and that's where we are determined to go. Very interesting, for instance, when I took over as artistic director, there were a handful of women directors who had worked at Stratford. Last season, 2 seasons ago, the summer season was entirely directed by women. You have to make the opportunities available so that you train up and you skill up, and you make the possibility of that visible. Yeah, but we've got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and I will just say, because I know we have like 1 minute, but a lot of theater companies are thinking precisely through these issues, and I think the RSC is doing a great job thinking about what it means to be an actively anti-racist institution. And I think that framing is particularly important, because then it's like everything has to be up for discussion, like from your ushers to your directors. And I think once you're striving to be an actively anti-racist institution, then there will be opportunities, and there will be, I think there'll be a flood of unbelievably talented artists of color who want to work in all the facets of the stage. So
yeah, I agree.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to everyone for your questions. We're sorry if we didn't get time to answer yours. And I'd like to say an enormous thank you to Ayanna and Greg for the wonderful, rich and thought-provoking discussion that we've had.